Very pleased this afternoon to have Michael Hightower to be the moderator. First, he's gonna speak to you for a few minutes and kind of give you a big picture overview, and then he's gonna turn it over and have the other speakers speak, and then we'll have him moderate the panel with questions that he'll generate and questions that you may have from the audience. So keep your questions in mind. This is probably going to be one of the most interesting panels here, if not certainly one that I really embellish with dealing with desalination and groundwater management. I've known Mike Hightower, for probably 25 years or so. He and I met. He's an Aggie like I am, BSMS, New Mexico State University, and he was at Sandia Laboratories for 38 years. Doesn't look that old, but he's been there a long time. He started when he was about 15. He told me. Was a very bright student in high school, so he just went on. But I worked with Mike on several projects dealing with desalination and everything associated with the work that Sandia Labs did for many years on working with the Bureau of Reclamation, in particular with the Water Research Foundation and others on desalination development, and particularly a lot of it dealing with concentrate management. Mike, in my opinion, is one of the premier experts in this country on desalination. He also, and I worked with him when he was in charge of the project with the Department of Energy on basically energy and water nexus, dealing with all the energy that is required for desalination and all the water that's required for energy, and how we can pair those two together, whatever. They filed a report several years ago. I think it's only been the last couple of years, maybe 3 years, that report has really been taken real seriously by DOE. And maybe Mike will talk about this, but it looks like there's going to be some major advances by DOE in the near term to be able to finally embark on their role with regard to desalination. So Mike is now a professor at the University of New Mexico. So he's a Lobo, but I think he still wears Aggie clothes up in Albuquerque. But let me turn it over now to Mike Hightower.
Thank you. That's a nice introduction, Ed. I have my Aggie colors on, but I'm not going to show them right now. That might not be appropriate. So the panel, what we've been asked to do is have the panel. Everybody's not a Lobo. We have some Lobo fans here. So we're going to take about 10 minutes. This is going to kind of be quick overview of projects and activities associated with desal. We're going to try to leave time then in at the end of the panel to have everybody have questions. So if you have a technical question about a slide or something, I might let you have one question, but we're going to hold most of the general questions for the end. So we're going to try to go through this quickly. I wanted to set the stage for desalination and why looking at that and the use of non-traditional water resources on the border is important. So I'll just start with this. I gave a presentation back in 2012 to this same organization in WADAS and I was the only one that talked about desal. Desal today, we have two panels, about 12 talks. So I think it kind of highlights where desal has moved in the last 7 or 8 years. I just wanted to remind people what I was saying back then, and some of the issues we saw it this morning. The climate issues are not going away. This is not a drought. This is an arid scenario, an arid cycle that we're in. We're going to have to look at this. It's the data that David showed this morning, and I'll show again, 300-year arid cycle that we're in. We're about 100 years into it. 50% reduction in surface water flows says that we're going to have to look at other types of non-traditional resources to address this limitations on freshwater supplies. Social impacts that I talked about 6 or 7 years ago was looking at problems around the globe in the mid-latitudes that we're in of migration. So if you look at what's going on in Syria today, it's exactly the problem with water availability, impacts on agricultural economy, and impacts there and causing migration issues. We have migration issues in and out of the Southwest because of water issues. So that impacts economic development. It causes changes in laws and politics. So those are some of the challenges that Dean Maldonado talked about. Some of the solutions and the opportunities are, we're going to have to look at non-traditional resources, and brackish water is one of those for New Mexico, Arizona. Texas also has brackish water, in California, but they also have seawater that they can use. But some of the inland states don't have that access to seawater. But there's also municipal industrial claimed wastewater that could be utilized. That will be talked about in another session. And I think that the last bullet here, that investments in innovative water infrastructure could have much more benefits, both social and economic, than building walls. Ed alluded to that today. We were looking at putting 16 or $20 billion into walls. I can tell you that you put $2 or $3 billion into water infrastructure, you have enough water for 6 or 10 million additional people with economic development and huge returns on investment, rather than sinking money into something that's probably going to be a white elephant after a few years. So that's a political statement, but that's something we talked about, heard before lunch, is if we can kind of get together on a joint ideals of what we want to do with this region, I think we have an opportunity to do that, both on the American and the Mexican side of the border. And I think that's one thing that most people in here would probably agree to. So let me go through this. This is very similar to what Dave showed. What I did is I averaged the flows over the last 2,000 years by 50-year increments to try and look at the trends. The point that I'm going to make here is that during all these arid cycles that we see, the last arid cycle, I think the only person in here that knows about that would be John Hawley. He was around in that last arid cycle. But we see these major abandonments of civilization in these arid cycles that do last 300 years or so. Angkor Wat and the Anasazi abandonments, the Mayan in mid-Mexico, their classic period ended at about 900 to 1000 AD. It was all associated with all of these long-term arid cycles that are very difficult for civilizations to address. So the next abandonment, we're in one of these arid cycles, I think, based upon the tree ring data that David talked about this morning. I don't know whether that's Phoenix. I don't know whether that's Las Vegas. I don't know whether that's the border region. I think we have to understand that this is real, that we have to figure out a solution. We have to figure it out soon. We've got another 100 or so years to go. I think that we're talking here today about desal because it could be a very quick and easy interim solution to address and provide additional water resources and water supplies quickly. This is just highlights what Dave said. Projected Rio Grande flows are going to be probably 50% of normal over the next 50 to 100 years. So if we're going to sit here and hope for rain, Dave said let's pray for snow or hope for snow. That's only a couple of months or weeks left. If we pray for rain, we're going to have to be praying a lot for a long time and a whole lot to address the 50% reductions over the next 100 years. So one of the things we talk about is what are the costs? Can we bring in water? There was a question this morning. Can we do desal? Can we do aquifer storage and recovery? Probably a little bit of all of those is good, but I have here energy demands by kilowatt hour per 1,000 gallons. And what you're seeing is brackish desalination and wastewater reuse and aquifer storage are probably the cheapest short-term opportunities. They have the lowest demand for energy, which really relates to costs, so they have kind of the lowest costs. So I think in an area where we have a lot of brackish resources, or you have access to seawater, desalination has gotten to the point where it's probably one of the quickest to implement and least expensive ways to address shortages of water supply. This is kind of my last figure. This is a trend in water costs in dollars per 1,000 gallons. If you look at fresh water on the bottom, the yellow, kind of the range of development of freshwater resources, and then you have seawater desal, the blue line and the green line is brackish water desal. And what we've seen since about 2000 is that the growth in desalination across the U.S. has jumped significantly, and the reason for that is that the cost of desal has now gotten to the point where it's competitive in many situations with freshwater supplies. And if you see the trend by 2020, what we're looking at is almost parity of bringing in the next unit of fresh water versus local desalination and treatment of nearby brackish water is cost comparative. And that's one of the reasons that you see people talking about in the United States this term one water, because the wastewater treatment guys, the water research guys are now all merged into one research organization, and they call it a one water solution because the costs of these different water supplies have gotten to the point where they're somewhat equal. So I know desal has gotten a little bit of a rap in the past about too costly and concentrate management issues, but if you look at the trends, the research that's been done is improving that. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is a lot of people talk about energy. I want to mention and opportunities. If you look at the suggestions by the Energy and Information Agency, by DOE, if you look at the costs associated with power plants going in 2019, this is with transmission and distribution costs, the lowest cost is likely to be combinations of combined cycled natural gas with wind and solar. So if you look at a region of the country and the region of the world that has high wind resources, high solar energy resources, and access to a lot of natural gas, the border region of the Southwest has all those resources. So as far as energy supplies, the energy needed to improve water supplies and treat are probably going to be the lowest here that they are anyplace else in the country. So we have huge opportunities. One, we have huge supplies of brackish water or access to seawater. We have low energy costs projected. We've got the need. I think we just need the wherewithal to get a common vision that this is an opportunity to supplement our freshwater resources that we're going to be in dire straits with quickly with new brackish water resources. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Peju, who is from New Mexico State also. So we've got a kind of trend here of Aggies on the stand. And she's going to talk about some work that she's been doing with a team of people at New Mexico State on brackish water resources in New Mexico that are transboundary with Mexico. So, thanks, Peju.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all. Thank you for this opportunity to allow me give a research update on an ongoing study that we assess the feasibility of brackish water desalination to supply the water for the municipal and the industrial uses in Santa Teresa area in New Mexico. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the team, Dr. Phil King and Brian Hurd and Kenneth Carroll with New Mexico State University, and also Dr. John Hawley. And for this project, we rely on his over 50 years of experience to help us to define the hydrogeological framework. So we really appreciate his participation in this project. And the project is funded by the Bureau of Reclamation and the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute. We also collaborate with Border Industrial Association, Camino Real Regional Utility Authority, and University of Chihuahua. So Santa Teresa is a bright spot for the economic development in the area because this graph, it shows that we have, I cannot point it. Oh, it doesn't show. Okay, so we have the land port of entry to Mexico. This is the largest border crossing for cattle in the country. Also, there is a huge Union Pacific intermodal transportation facility and a growing industry base. And on the Mexico side, there is also a planned development of economic growth there as well. But for the entire region, it's related to, it basically relies on the limited freshwater resources entirely, and we need the sustainable water infrastructure to support the economic development in the area. So even though this area has very limited recharge and the interactions of brackish groundwater, but we have a vast quantity of aquifer that has brackish water with salinity around between 1,000 to 10,000 milligram per liter that can be used for as alternative water supply. And also the water situation in this area is very complex. And we all know that Texas has filed a lawsuit against New Mexico in the U.S. Supreme Court, claiming that the withdrawals of groundwater that is hydraulically connected to the Rio Grande has intercepted Texas water. And the U.S. has intervened on the Texas side. So, but groundwater is the main source for the municipal and the industrial water uses in lower Rio Grande. So for New Mexico, Lower Grande region, we must have to develop alternative water supplies and diversify its water supply. So as I said, we have this brackish groundwater available for desalination, but the question is we need to understand the hydrogeologic condition of the feature of that aquifer so we can develop the groundwater desalination sustainably. And we want to understand what is the interactions between the fresh water and the groundwater aquifer, and what is the flows and the mixing and the salt transfers between the freshwater aquifer and the saline water aquifer, and from with the shallow aquifer and the deep aquifer. So right now, Professor Kenneth Carroll at NMSU, he is taking the lead to collect the data on the geochemical and isotopic data to understand the interactions of freshwater and groundwater systems, and then to evaluate if groundwater desalination is sustainable, because we want to see if the groundwater can sustain the large amount of withdrawal of the water for desalination. And also we need the economic evaluation about this brackish groundwater desalination. What will be the impact on the society, on the environment, on the economic development? So, Professor Brian Hurd, he's in the audience here, and he's developing a coupled hydroeconomic model with the behavior model to evaluate the economic, societal, and environmental impact of desalination, water reuse, and also considering the impact on the disadvantaged communities and the impact of climate change. So besides this work, we also will conduct a proof of concept demonstration project using the membranes technologies and to treat the existing brackish water from the wells. And at the end of the project, we want to develop an organizational and financial plan for moving forward with the implementation of brackish groundwater in Santa Teresa area. So just to give you an update, we are working with the stakeholders to assess the water demand, the current supply, and the binational potential of that desalination plant. And we're also collaborating with University of Chihuahua. So while we are collecting our own data on the water quality and hydrogeological modeling, we also started literature review on the current existing data for the Mesilla Basin. So this is a report published in 2017 by Andrew Tipple with USGS, and he did the data analysis for the data of 85 years from the 1922 to 2007 on the 239 wells in this Doña Ana County and El Paso County, in this part, in the U.S. part of the Mesilla Basin. So basically, he found that in the northern part of the basin, the TDS, or the salt concentration, is generally less than 1,000 milligram per liter. So that is a slight brackish water. But in the southern part, the TDS could be higher than 1,000, and it could be even higher than 3,000 milligram per liter with increasing depths. So these graphs, it shows that the salinity distribution of the Mesilla Basin and at different depths. So the first graph, it shows the water depths at 0, second is 250 feet, and 500 and 750 feet. So the tanned color, it means that the electrical resistance is very high. That means it's less saline water. And then when the color becomes purple, that means the salinity is increasing. So we can see clearly with the increasing depths of the basin, and the salinity keeps on increasing until the depth of 1,750 feet. And we also analyzed that the salt composition of that groundwater. And in 44 groundwater samples collected and included in the report, about 82% of the water samples represented sodium-dominated water, especially sodium chloride and sulfate type. Only 18% of the water is calcium chloride sulfate or calcium bicarbonate type of water. And in the groundwater, the nitrate and the nitrite concentration is very low, less than 8 milligram per liter, and the primary drinking water regulation is less than 10. So the nitrate is less a problem. But there's some spirally soluble salts that might cause scaling if we implement membrane desalination technologies. For example, the silica concentration can be as high as 85 milligram per liter. But the pesticides they analyzed were all below the detection limit. So that is a good news. And besides this data, we also collected samples from 5 groundwater wells in the southern part of Mesilla Basin. And we found elevated arsenic concentration from 7 to 25 microgram per liter. And the primary drinking water regulation in the United States is 10. So that means we need to remove arsenic from the water. And the sodium is also can be high as 600 milligram per liter, and the secondary drinking water regulation is 250. So that means we need to include the desalination. Of course, the TDS is pretty high, up to 2,600 milligram per liter, and the water quality varies significantly in the region. So this slide I steal from Dr. Hawley, and this is his conclusion. And we need a very smart development of groundwater mining, and especially in our region, because this is arid region, we have very limited fresh water supplies, surface and groundwater, and we need to support a binational population of more than 2.5 million of people. But we have a very, very promising groundwater, but it is brackish groundwater, and then the economically recoverable volume is about 65 million acre feet with the TDS less than 5,000 milligram per liter. So that is very promising for desalination. This picture shows that this is the pilot system we are going to implement to treat the brackish groundwater. Okay. Then this is just a brief summary of what we learned so far. That means we have a very good brackish groundwater. We can use it as alternative water supply, and then to support the municipal and the industry uses in the region. And also another good sign is many sites of ongoing aquifer depletion can also be ideal sites for the disposal of the concentrate, and we can also do a groundwater recharge project. Okay, so this is an ongoing research, and then we will keep on working on the assessment of water demand, and then we will assess the regulatory and the institutional framework for desalination and concentrate treatment, and then we will characterize the hydraulic connection with the Rio Grande system of the groundwater, and we will evaluate the technology economically and also technically. So we will consider that binational potential of this brackish groundwater desalination plant. So if you are interested in the reference from the TIPO report, this is the reference. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
The next presentation we have is by Judy Adams. She's from Brownsville. If you've been at water conferences on the border before, Brownsville has been looking at desal for a number of years, and she's going to give us an update on the status of that desal plant and those activities. So, thank you.
Can you hear me okay? All right. Let's see.
Okay, you got it.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me here today to speak to you about an exciting project that we have. It's on the Brownsville seawater desalination pilot study that was conducted in 2007 and 2008. So these are some of the project's objectives, and I'm going to just go over, this is the agenda. We're going to go over the objectives, the pilot study, the treatment processes, some of the conclusions, lessons learned, next steps. So just as a bit of a background, in 2004, Brownsville completed a feasibility study to see if we could construct a large-scale, 25 million gallon per day seawater desalination facility. And basically, that feasibility study recommended two possible pretreatment units for a large-scale facility. The study recommended either ultrafiltration membrane pretreatment or a conventional type of treatment as a pretreatment system ahead of seawater reverse osmosis membrane desalination. So this pilot study was a continuance of that feasibility. We wanted to test out whether or not those treatment technologies would really work, and we wanted to test them under site-specific conditions at varying operating conditions. We felt like the pilot study would provide more precision in the planning and the design of the full-scale processes, and it would certainly reduce some of that risk that's associated with trying to true up the cost for a full-scale facility. This is the location of our pilot study. Of course, it's in Brownsville, and if for those that don't know, Brownsville is located at the southern tip of Texas, and we're right across from Matamoros, Tamaulipas in Mexico. And as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side, that's the Gulf of Mexico. So we're just a few miles inland from the Gulf of Mexico. And so we located the pilot study on the Brownsville ship channel. If you see the yellow dot, you can see that the pilot study was placed on the north shore of the ship channel. And you see the inset picture, you see we're right next to the shrimp basin on that ship channel. These were our partners for the pilot study. Of course, we were a partner in the project. We were provided with major funding or significant funding from the Texas Water Development Board. The site was donated by the Port of Brownsville, and in our